Sure. My name's Mary Robinette Kowal. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer. I write novels and short fiction. I've won 2 Hugo Awards for my short fiction. I'm also a member of the podcast Writing Excuses. And then, as a side note, I'm a professional puppeteer and an audiobook narrator. And I do go by Mary Robinette because I am that Southern.
I am Wendy Nikel. I also write science fiction and fantasy, all the way from Flash, under 1,000 words, all the way up to, I have written some novels. The longest I've gotten published are these novellas. They are time travel. They're over in the dealer room. Check them out. I also am a managing editor at Flash Fiction Online, which means that if you submit your stories there, chances are pretty good that I'm going to be the one to reject you. You've got one.
You've got a mic right there.
Oh, I do. Okay. It's not on.
Hello? Okay. My name's Holly Kelly. I am an author of clean paranormal romance. My first book that I had published is Rising. It's a 4-book series. It's done really well. But yeah, and I'm also a student. I'm finishing up my degree to be an English teacher. So I've been reading a lot of classics, which is different for me because I usually don't read the classics. But yeah, so that's kind of who I am.
Fantastic.
Okay, first question for you. You've got a story that you want to tell. What are the things, what are the tools that you use, if you use any, to start deciding how to tell it? You're starting to put words on the page. How does that begin for you?
Do you mean from the idea point or the actual word? Like we've already got the idea and we start throwing
let's
things
assume
down.
that you've got an outline and now you're starting to put prose on the page.
So the way I feel about short fiction in particular is that it's like, so you know the Olympics. There's sports things, and I know. But in the Olympics, you can watch the Olympics by like watching the Olympics, which is you watch the entire thing. You watch you've got your favorite gymnast, but you watch everybody else because you want to know who the competition is. You watch the road to the Olympics. You watch the training sessions. You watch the compulsory floor exercises. All of these things, and then they come out and they do their flippy thing, and it's amazing. And then you stick around because you want to see the judges' scores, and the East German judge is always terrible, even though there's no longer an East Germany. And then after that, you stick around because you want to see the exit interview, and it's amazing, and everything is fantastic. That's a novel. Short fiction, someone sends you a clip to a YouTube thing where someone just walks out, they don't even walk out, they just start flipping, and then they stick their landing, and you're like, that was amazing! It's the same flippy, okay? The difference is where you start. So what I try to do with my short fiction is figure out what the core of my story is, what that nugget, that thing is. And I start and I try to ground my readers as quickly as possible. And so within my first 3 sentences, I try to make sure that my readers know where we are, who we're with, and something about the genre or mood. And I try to do that within the first 3 sentences.
Sounds like a pretty good start. It essentially is the same sort of thing that I do, starting with, okay, what is our conflict here? And how do we get our character to that conflict? And depending on how long you want the story, that's going to determine how far you back up and whether you show, the gymnasts in the, I don't know, I guess they have locker rooms. I would assume they do. If you show them in there getting all fired up, or if you start, 2 months earlier when they're still in training and they finally realize, hey, I get to go to the Olympics. So the length is going to determine, or the amount of conflict along the way is going to determine the length. I think I said that right. That's right.
I am more of a discovery writer. So I start with just a nugget of an idea, and I just start writing. So I don't do, I've tried outlining and pre-planning, and it never works for me. So that's what I do. I just, for my first book, my idea is what if a mermaid were born on land and she didn't know she was a mermaid? and then I just started writing. So I just take kind of a interesting, unique situation, and I just start writing. So that's me.
Let me ask you a question then, Holly, and we'll come back the other direction. As you are writing, as you are putting words on the page, do you ever write a sentence and as you read it, fall in love with it or absolutely hate it or whatever, and it directs you in a direction that you didn't expect to go into?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, there are many times when I'll write a sentence and it sparks an idea. And I'll be like, oh, okay. So yeah, that's why I can't outline, because I'm always like doing tangents here and there, and and then at the end I have to make sure everything works and fits together. But yeah, definitely.
I also tend to do discovery writing especially with short stories. By the time you outline it all, I kind of am like, okay, well, there's the story then. And so it's hard for me to get into it with the outline, especially with short stories. And I forget where I was going with that.
I do both. I outline and I discovery write. My outlines are often a discovery. And then I will also have the thing where it's like, oh, this sentence is everything has just changed because of this sentence I've thrown down, and I will revise my outline if I've outlined something, or if I'm discovery writing, then I will explore it. But for me it depends. And this is a tangent about outlining versus not, but for me outlining is just to hold the parts of the story in my head that I can't hold on their own. So most of the time, the short fiction, I have like a thumbnail sketch of this is kind of the general shape. But there are also times where I will just dive in and start going. But even when I'm discovery writing, within those first 3 sentences, I try to ground my reader as quickly as possible. And then likewise with the conflict, I try to hit that within the first 13 lines, or a conflict. I'm very methodical sometimes. Well, okay, let me explain why the first 13. The reason I do the first 13 is from a crass commercial thing, which is that in standard manuscript format, the first 13 lines is your first half page. And if you do not hook your editor that you're submitting to within many of them will not read past that first page. So I try to get my conflict up as quickly as possible, and also the earlier mechanically, the sooner you have the conflict hit the page, the faster the pace will feel to the reader.
That leads me to another question. If I'm thinking in terms of the beginning of the story, the early parts of the story, character, conflict, setting, some sort of hook. Those are the rules that I use for writing back cover copy. But I feel like those things also need to appear as early as possible in the book. What do you do with your words to make sure that those things come to the surface? How do you...
Because I do, but I will talk too much.
So I end up writing a lot of flash fiction. I love flash fiction. And one of the things in reading flash fiction and reading flash fiction submissions is those things really need to be in that first paragraph. So I've kind of gotten it almost a habit that when I sit down to write, I figure out, okay, so who is the character? What is their conflict or thing that's going wrong or thing that they weren't expecting? And what is the setting? And I just start, I may not even have, any of the rest of the story, any of the rest of the characters down, but I have to make sure that I have those before I start the story, or else it isn't going to work. And another thing for me, I don't know if this works that way for everyone, but if I don't nail the tone that I want in that first paragraph or two, then it's all off and it is a mess to try to work out later. So for me, tone is one of those things that if I get that, then I feel like I've got enough to hold on to keep the story going.
Yeah, tone is really important. Another thing I try to do is I try to not put everything in it. You want to leave a mystery for them to turn the page. So, put a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on here, what's going to happen. So it's not just what you say, it's what you don't say. You kind of give little hints as to kind of where the book is going to go or where your work is going to go.
So what I do is that I try to, I agree with everything they're saying, but what I try to do very specifically is have my character interact with the environment. So rather than just describing a room, I have my character, we learn about the room through the way my character interacts with it. So we get my character's emotional state as well as their tactile relationship with the space, which allows my words then to do double duty, which gets me into the scene faster.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I do the same thing. I call it description through action.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're doing the action and they are you don't say you don't just describe the scenery as much as you describe how they're interacting with the scenery. If you want to describe what something looks like, your character needs to be looking at it and paying attention to what they're seeing. So you don't want to be just, unless you're doing a narration. But you want to make sure that you are in the head of your character and that you are describing what they're doing.
I do want to say that there are, this is the kind of story that I tend to write. But there is another type, which is, so what we're talking about there is an action-driven opening versus a voice-driven opening, and these are two different things.
Yeah.
So an action-driven opening begins with a character doing something, and that's interacting with the environment. A voice-driven opening is driven by the narrative voice, and that usually begins with someone or the narration describing something. And with that, what you're looking at is really rich language that reflects the tonal quality of the piece and the character. The examples that I'm coming up with are unfortunately novel-based. But Bradbury will often have, sometimes he will have very evocative tonal openings. Philip K. Dick, also much more evocative. Whereas a Heinlein story, and I'm using older things because I'm like, you probably have read those. Those are going to dive right into action.
I think a good example, and I want to hear examples from you, things that you've read where the voice, the tone, the prose have drawn you in, and why. Because when we write, we sort of are what we read after a fashion. One of my favorite voice-driven openings begins, it was a silence of 3 parts. Absolutely beautiful, because I'd never before had silence described as multipartite, and already he's asked a question, and I want to know the answer. And Pat's prose, beautiful, Patrick Rothfuss, Name of the Wind, first line. What sorts of things speak to you in this way? Voice-driven, action-driven. What are the things you've read that really worked for you?
So one of the things that I jotted down that's one of those examples of first lines that really give you an insight into the character, into the conflict, into what's going on, is the beginning of Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson, where it starts out, "I've seen Steelheart bleed." And it gives you right there a picture in your head of, okay, so we know that this character, that this is unusual. Okay, so if the narrator's pointing it out, that means that this is something strange. So why doesn't this person who's called Steelheart, or this thing that's called Steelheart, we don't know yet, why is it unusual that they're bleeding? And how does the narrator feel about that? And how is this driving the story? It's very, gets right to the point, gets right into the setting and the scene. Another one that I jotted down was the beginning of Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which I'm sure you might remember. Is there was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And it's just perfect because that's exactly who Eustace is, and it gives a great tonal beginning to this story and this character arc.
So since you've asked for favorite, this is actually from short fiction. If You Were a Dinosaur, My Love by Rachel Swirsky, which won a Hugo. If you were a dinosaur, my love, then you would be a T-Rex. You'd be a small one, only 5 feet 10 inches, the same height as human you. You'd be fragile-boned, and you'd walk with a delicate and polite gait as you could manage on massive talons. And this is the opening for it's a very short piece, and it's beautiful, but it is a voice-driven piece.
By way of clarification, panel description doesn't say we have to be talking about short fiction. It just means making it tight.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to talk novels, by all
Great.
means, bring it on.
Good.
It's Monster Hunter. The opening has my absolute favorite line, and it kind of pulls you in with just a few words, where he says that he had I wish I brought the notes. He had the chance to live the American dream. He was able to throw his boss off a 14-story window. There's more to it. I didn't quote it very well, but yeah, I mean, just those first words are so important. It just the tone, the mystery, the pull, just everything is just so important. So, as much time as I spend on other parts of my novels, I spend a huge amount of time figuring out my first line, and then a huge amount figuring out my first page, and you need to have as much there with as a few words. You don't want to make it flowery. You don't want to make it, too overly wordy.
Yeah.
So, the important thing is not how beautiful the word is how appropriate the word is for what you want to convey.
I love good first lines, good first pages. For my own part, I feel like I've written several. The hard part for me is always, what do I do to make sure that the promise made by that first page of prose is kept throughout the story? What sorts of things do y'all do when you feel like you've stuck your entry? How do you make sure you're sticking it in the middle and at the end?
I'm like, we're all.
We're too polite.
Yeah, that's the scary part for me when I start a book and because most of my books, they're very action based, although they have romance too. So I start with something really powerful, and then from there, you have to make sure you do follow through on that promise that you're going to have some action in this, in your book, or however you start your novel, you want to carry that through. So if you have like a really snarky character and it's more, based on personality and not so much the action, you want to carry that through and you want to explore that character. So yeah, and the things I do is just, I just write it, and then I try and think of, okay, how can I, because you've got your start for here, and then you want to character develop, and then you want to bring in action scenes. So I don't know. For me, I do it more off of instinct and what's exciting for me. And then, I try and look for parts that kind of sag and are kind of boring, and I try and tighten those up and, shorten them. And so it's just, I don't know.
I'm going to want to come back to that, but do you guys have responses as well?
One real quick. With flash fiction in particular, because it's something I love, one of the things that I enjoy is when an author can take that first sentence and then tie it in, come back around to it at the end. That just makes it feel very, very whole, very, it does that double duty then, because then at the end you can kind of go, oh, okay, that's why they mentioned this one tiny little detail in the first sentence, or that's where this story, I thought it was going to go somewhere else, and look at that, it went somewhere completely different, and now reading the beginning has more meaning to it, knowing how the end works out.
So for me, there's two things. One is the kinds of conflicts that I'm going to be raising, and I try to look in that opening. I try to make sure that whatever conflict I've raised is thematically linked, even if it's not the exact conflict. So using a James Bond film as an example, they begin with what's called a cold open, which is James Bond is running and he's doing, there's explosions and and then he pulls out some neat piece of gadgetry that looks like a fountain pen and then is a laser, and then something explodes and he drives away in a fast car, and then you have to go and you have to endure, and now we are at the offices and someone is reading him a riot act for some breach of protocol that he's done. But the thing is that even though that beginning does not actually usually have anything to do with the plot of the rest of the film, it tells you you're going to be in for somebody who's doing a lot of explosions and he's going to use a cool piece of gadgetry. When they go to the office and Q hands him a fountain pen, you're like, oh, is it gonna be a laser this time or a plasma sword? Wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, the point is that when I am discovery writing, I look back at the promises that I made to the reader. It's like, what kind of story did I set up? And I try to always refer back those causal links. When I am plotting, then I usually start with my middle outline and then try to make sure I've woven those into the beginning. So for me, it depends on kind of which way I'm going. But so that's kind of structurally what I'm doing. And that helps me avoid story bloat if I'm always thinking about the kinds of conflicts that I've got. But then for the language of it as well, what I'm trying to do is make sure that if I promise to the reader at the beginning, this is going to be a funny story, that I have bits of humor woven through. If I'm like, this story is going to be introspective, that I have moments where the character pauses for introspection. So I try to make sure that I am doing these things kind of all the way through.
So I said I was going to come back to bits that sag, bits that aren't working right. Before I do that, if there are questions that you would like to ask of the other panelists, be thinking of those, because I find we ask such good questions of each other. It's great, and by we I mean you. But how do you, when something is sagging, when something's boring, how did you figure that out? How do you know?
Usually my critique partners will tell me that. Be like, okay, hey, this isn't really doing anything. And one of the things that I found helpful for me, that personally when I come to those parts, it's because I need to increase the tension. And I need to find another conflict, another, tension between two people, that the reason that it's sagging for me personally, and I don't know about anybody else, if this is a common thing, I'm assuming it is, but for me, those sagging moments come when everyone's just kind of getting along and doing their thing, and not much is really happening, because you need that tension.
For me, sometimes you can get so involved in the words and what you're saying that you don't actually look back and say, okay, what's actually happening here? Is this really something that will drive forward your story? So, and it's funny because sometimes you think, oh, this is a great chapter, I've got a great description, and then you're like, yeah, but it's only just someone sitting at a table having breakfast, and,
Mm-hmm.
how is that, if there's something important in that, but yeah, just step back and try and look, okay, actually, what is happening?
Yeah, going along with that's one of the things that I do. Going from a rough draft to, okay, now I need to revise, one of the things that I do is go through each scene and try to figure out, okay, my main character, what is their goal? And if the antagonist is in there, I also need to figure out what is their goal and how are they working toward that goal? What are they doing that is progressing them towards that goal? Even if they don't succeed, they need to be doing something to try to get there. Yes.
Oh, thank you. So the way I identify when something is sagging is if I am bored. The hardest thing for me to learn to do as a writer was to trust my reader reactions. We've spent decades as writers first as readers, honing our taste as readers. We know what we like and what we don't like. And it's very easy to say, well, but I know what's happening here, so of course it's not going to maintain the tension, but you've got a piece of favorite media that you've consumed multiple times. You can quote things by heart. Anybody want a peanut? I mean, there's something that you do, that you love, and you still have that emotional reaction to it. So if you are not having the same kind of reaction to your own work, it's a sign that something is broken. So specifically for me, I look for there's the is anything happening in this scene? But first I just read it as a reader, and if I discover that I'm skimming a section or I'm getting drowsy, I take a look at it, because sometimes even when there's conflict in there, I haven't given you a reason to care about the stuff that's going on. So it can still sag even in the middle of a giant action scene. So that's what I look for, is my own reactions.
Another thing to consider is each chapter needs to have its own plot line. Where you have some build up, even if it's it's not like an action scene, you have to have a build up and some kind of a climax to keep the story moving along. One thing that I do to keep my readers turning the page after a chapter's done is I end a lot of my chapters with a cliffhanger that gets picked up, a couple chapters later. So yeah, you've got your character development where they're not, you don't have quite as exciting things happening, but you learn a lot more about your character and you start to care about your character, because it doesn't matter how harrowing your scene is. If they don't care about your character, then it's not going to be, they're not going to care about what's happening. So yeah, just watching that plot line.
Okay, we're about ready to open it up for questions from the audience. Are there questions that you have for each other?
So with this whole discovery writing thing, how many drafts do you do? Like Nancy Kress, for instance, yeah. Nancy Kress is a discovery writer. Mm-hmm. And what she does is she writes the entire thing, and then she junks the entire manuscript and writes it again I know.
That's working twice.
I know, and then she writes it again, and that's the thing that she turns in. Because she says that it takes the first draft for her to figure out what the story is about. That would break me.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you do, like what happens after you've written the thing.
Well, when I write, and I don't know how many writers actually write this way, but I'll write and then I'll go back through it and I'll kind of, and I know it's like a really slow way to write, and as fast as I can write, I can usually only do like 2 books a year, which is kind of slow for a writer. But yeah, I'll write out a scene and then I go back. And
no, that is not slow. That is not slow.
Some writers, maybe.
That is.
But yeah, I continually go back and write and go back and write and go back. So yeah, so I'm like writing, editing, doing it all kind of at the same
2
time.
books a year is slow if you're comparing yourself to Goosebumps.
Yeah.
No, I know. I've got some friends that are like putting out a book every 3 months or something, and it's like I can't even go there. No. So yeah, between 1 to 2 books is what I can do. But yeah, I don't ever scrap something. I'll scrap chapters and things, but I'm continually like fixing things, tweaking things, and so that's kind of how I write, and that's how I also get ideas for what happens next. So if I don't really know what's going to happen next, I go back and fix what I've already written, and then sometimes I get ideas of where to go next from that.
So I'm on a panel later today at 3 p.m. called Plotting for Pantsers, and so I'll probably get into all of that then. But basically, I started novel writing using NaNoWriMo.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
So I take that month and I draft it all out, and as I've gotten more experience, I kind of have become more of a plotter, but still a discovery writer, where I now know, okay, these are the 3 acts, these are the beats I need to hit. So if I know I'm, 10,000 words into this novel, I know I know what beat I'm coming up on next, and I know, okay, well, I need to get there somehow, and I need to move the plot toward that somehow. So I do the first messy draft, and then I usually go through a major revision, reading through a couple times, one time, making sure that the whole plot actually works and that I don't have huge, plot holes in the middle of it. And then another time going through and deepening the characters, because I know that's something that I personally, I'm a very sparse drafter. So I know that those are things that I need to go back and add in more of the characters' internal life. And then I go through again and make it pretty.
Tangential follow-up question, and the follow-up question...
Make it pretty.
Oh, sorry. I stepped on the end of your line. My bad. Tangential follow-up question for everyone. How many here in the room have participated in NaNoWriMo at some point? You're awesome! Even if you didn't raise your hand, you're awesome. But wow! How many people have participated and won, have hit the 50,000 word mark? You guys are brilliant. Any losers in the room? Oh, join me. Represent. All right.
I am stubborn.
Anyone who has no idea what NaNoWriMo is? Great. NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month. In the month of November, you attempt to write a 50,000 word novel. It's fun. I have written all of my novels on the Nano model as well. Except for the one that I'm currently working on, but only because I had some family stuff that kind of derailed me for a couple of months.
That was the tangent.
Yeah. Oh, and I was going to say, I did it once, and I finished it, but I will never do it again. It about killed me. So yeah,
It is
one
not for
time
everybody.
I succeeded, and it about destroyed my love for writing.
The thing that I love about it, and the thing that I think we learned from it, and I'm learning from our panel right now, is that there's no one right way to do everything. NaNoWriMo was not the right way for me to get stuff done, but boy did I learn a lot trying to do it.
Yeah.
So, do you have questions for our panelists? Get your hands up in the air. Yes, ma'am.
So you've written something and you have overwritten it. What are some tools or techniques that you found work well to get it down to those graceful words where you go, there it is?
Here are 2. The first one is called the 10% technique. In that you cut your prose by 10%. So if you've got a 100-word passage, then you cut it down, you cut 10 words from it. There are some people who think that you should, Stephen King says you should do this with everything. I don't agree with him. But it is actually, I think, a useful exercise for everyone to try at least once cutting an entire manuscript down by 10%. What it does is it forces you to focus on which words are the important words, and which things can be said with 1 word rather than 2. Like, she walked away from him. She retreated. Those are very different things. One of them, anyway, you get the point there. The other is a technique that I teach, which is called 1 sentence per concept. I need a pithier name for it. 1 sentence per concept. This is great for especially when you have a ginormous chunk of exposition that's in the right spot. It's like, this is actually where I need the exposition to happen, but it just goes on too long. What you do is you look at the text and you highlight the things, the concepts that you must have or the story will completely break. And then, so let's say that I've got half a page, and within that I realize that actually the only thing that I need to do is establish that the office is upstairs, that it is down a long hallway, and that he is nervous. And it turns out that I actually only need 3 things, but I have taken half page to get there. So that means that I'm allowed 3 sentences plus 1 for tone, because tone is something that you need to convey. I don't think that you should do this for everything because it can break a story, but as a useful exercise in just kind of what happens, take a chapter, do 10%, then do one sentence per concept, then do 10% again, and see how short you can get it before it stops being the same story.
Say that once enough, more slowly.
One sentence per concept. It's based on a puppetry concept, which is movement per phrase.
Any other answers to the
Yeah.
question? We should take another question.
I would also add to that, especially short stories. If you go out online and are looking at specific short story submission calls, a lot of them will have specific word count guidelines. And I think that that's how I have, over the years, eventually ended up becoming a very sparse writer, because I knew, okay, I want to write this story for this particular submission call, but I know they won't take anything over 3,000 words. So one way or another, I gotta make it fit.
Other questions?
So you talked about how, you need to maintain the tension in every scene and such. And I recently saw an interview for Hayao Miyazaki, when they were talking about how there were these gaps in a Ghibli film where it seems like nothing's happening, and he specifically talked about how he included the space between things. And so how do you maintain the forward motion of the story, but also give breathing room?
And I think that that has to do with how you look at tension. Because I think that a lot of people hear that word tension and think that it has to be a fight. It has to be, someone physically, a physical altercation, or, something that is big, a bomb exploding. And the tension that I think those kind of scenes end up using a lot is more of an internal tension, where somebody has to make a choice, or somebody is put in a situation that they're not entirely comfortable with, or people have differing ideas about things and may be trying to figure out in their heads a way to keep the peace and a way to compromise and make this work. So it's not necessarily big things happening, but it's those little moments where we get more insight into the characters and their internal conflicts.
As the token cartoonist on the panel, if I can address this for a moment, with Miyazaki, sometimes that stuff is just there to be beautiful, because that's the tone.
Yeah.
And boy, 3 minutes of Miyazaki's animation where there's no dialogue and maybe not a whole lot of story, but it is pretty, I'm on board for that, because that's why I came to that story. And that lesson translates to prose, but in Miyazaki's case, I think it's kind of more specific.
So I am a big fan of giving readers space to rest when something is very tense. Think of it like climbing a set of stairs. You need landings in order to continue climbing the stairs, in order to catch your breath and keep going. The catch is where you place the landing. So if you put a landing right at the foot of the stairs, then that's not useful. If you put a landing right before you get to the top, again, not useful. So you figure out where you want to put it. There's something called the recency primacy effect, which means that we notice the things at the beginning and at the end of something. We tend to gloss over the stuff in the middle. So much like climbing stairs, I will put my rest breaks in the middle of chapters, which gives my readers a chance to rest, but I can still take advantage of the cliffhanger effect. So that when they get to the end of the chapter, they don't just put the book down. The other trick that I will do with my rest periods, depending on the scenario, is that I will interrupt them. So I will give my reader and my characters a chance to rest, but then rather than ending the scene as now we have gone to bed and rested, I will interrupt that rest, or I will remind the reader that there is a niggling tension, like, now we are going to rest, but tomorrow we'll have to deal with the bomb, So it's like, oh no, you don't you think, but there's still stairs to climb.
Tony.
How does the nature of your revision change based off of the section of the book you're in? So obviously, does it kind of stay the same, your tone, or is it, oh, this is the middle of the book, so I'm going to focus more on this versus...
Yep. Rephrasing for the room, how does the nature of your revision change based on which portion of the book you're in?
Well, not being Mormon, there's more drinking towards the end of it.
We hydrate when we write.
I'm so glad you stayed healthy. But for me, what I do is I do a large structural pass first. So I go through and I make notes about the changes that I'm going to make, because I find that if I just start revising, I get a cascading effect where often with unintended consequences that cause the entire story to unravel. Mm-hmm. So I go through and I make notes first, and then I go back and implement. So it doesn't shift that much. I'm more likely to want things to be tighter in the last couple of chapters because we are racing towards the end. But I also personally, the fatal flaw that I have as a novelist is that I trained as a short story writer, so my instinct is to stick the landing and get out. And so with novels, what I'm often doing, the note to myself is, give them a little more time to breathe right here and to react.
What I do is I go through, and once I've finished from beginning to end, I go through, and that's where I do my outlining to see where are the high parts, where are the low parts, how is my story going. So yeah, I kind of do things backwards. Is I look at it and I see, okay, this part is sagging too much. I need to do something here. Or sometimes I'll have, too many harrowing scenes in a row, and you do that and you're going to wear out your reader. You can either slow down the pace, you can add a little bit of, like I do some humor in my books. Humor is a great way of relieving some tension. So yeah, you just go through it and you just make sure that you're not either boring your reader or having to, wearing your reader out.
Post-prose outlining is one of my favorite tools.
I do that too.
Because it's how I can quickly see at a glance what I've written. So you don't have it upside down or backwards, you have it spot on.